Hello, Internet. Welcome to Deleted Scenes. To start off, I should point out a couple of things that are different this week from what you might have expected. Number one, I'm about 45 minutes late, and there is a very good reason for that. This is our centennial week, and there is tons of stuff to do. And so this is when I was able to do Deleted Scenes. Um, it's just a really exciting week. We've got centennial preparations coming up. We've got a pastors conference over at Oregon Christian Convention, lots of stuff going on. And so here we are. The other thing is I said I was going to start doing these broadcasts in other places around the church, and I still intend to do that. But right now there's some sawing and heavy work going on down the end of the building. And it's louder than I think I could pull off here. And that's great because we're doing construction and the building is being transformed some. That's super exciting. So we're going to be in my office this week. And so this is when we are and where we are. So we are also in the last chapter of Ephesians. Yesterday I preached on Ephesians chapter 6. And so we finished the sermon series. And today we are finishing the Deleted Scenes series that we've been doing. And you'll remember there has been a slightly different focus between the sermon series and the Deleted Scenes. In the Deleted Scenes, we've been trying to trace through this theme of spiritual warfare that goes through every chapter of Ephesians so that we can connect it with the theme of unity that is the overarching theme of the book of Ephesians. And today we're talking about Ephesians chapter 6, which is the gimme chapter for talking about spiritual warfare, right? I mean, this is right over home plate, kind of a passage. It's the armor of God, and this is our go-to passage for spiritual warfare. And if you've been watching with us throughout this series, you'll know that I've been challenged in this study to start thinking of spiritual warfare in broader terms. And I think during my sermon, if you haven't listened to that yet, I finally yesterday came up with a way to explain what I've been thinking about spiritual warfare, which is that very often we use spiritual warfare only to describe the situations where there's no human being to blame. And so we'll talk about Satan putting up obstacles. I got a speeding ticket, and I got, and then I had a flat tire, and then all these things that happen in my life that get me off track, and we are quick to say that those things are the work of the devil, or to say that that's spiritual warfare. Or when we have, our emotional lives, we're quick to bring in the devil in that. But we don't typically bring in spiritual warfare terms when we're talking about interacting with other people. We don't tend to speak about spiritual warfare in terms of, our relationships with other people, except we will sometimes be quick to label the other person as a servant of the devil. But we aren't very quick to identify the devil or spiritual darkness as a third party that is trying to corrupt our relationships with other people. We don't want to blame the forces of darkness for my conflict with other people because I want to be able to blame that person, because if it's their fault, then I'm right in not wanting to forgive them. I'm right in being in conflict with them. But we talked in the sermon about how that is exactly the opposite of what Paul is saying. That there are things that happen to us that are because of the forces of darkness that don't involve other people. But the primary thing that Paul is concerned with here is the fact that Paul is trying to distract us, that Satan is trying to distract us from what he's doing by making us focus on the human beings that are in front of us, which means that when the devil is active, it's very often in relationships that we have with other people. It's in situations in our families and in our workplaces and in our schools and on our Facebook accounts. And that's really a big context for what he's talking about. So we shouldn't just think of spiritual warfare as this thing that only happens in my heart or in non-physical things. It's very important to remember that in the Bible, spiritual does not mean non-physical. And so spiritual warfare does not mean not physical warfare. And for Paul, the most important battlefields for spiritual warfare are our relationships with other people and the way we treat them and the way we reflect the gospel in our behavior. Now, what I want to do today as we look at the armor of God is I want to address something that came up as I was studying, but I simply did not have room to fit it in the sermon. But I think it's really instructive and helpful in the way we think about the armor of God. Have you ever asked yourself, why is it called the armor of God? Have you wondered with that? Why is it called the armor of God? You run into this question sometimes when you talk about the Lord's Prayer too. Why do we call it the Lord's Prayer? Because it's not actually Jesus is giving the prayer to the disciples. So some people will say we should call it the disciples' prayer because it belongs to them. And the question is, when we call it the armor of God, what are we saying? Are we saying that it is the armor that comes from God? And that's typically, wow, the lighting, sorry, see if I can make that a little less harsh. The armor of God. Actually, I might be able to fix that a little better. Live television. There we go. That should be a little bit better. All right, so the armor of God, we would probably think, well, that means it's the armor that is given to us by God. It comes from him. But actually, Paul did not come up with this concept of the armor of God. He came up with, or he is drawing from the Old Testament. And if you have a Bible with these center columns, right here, or sometimes they'll have them at the bottom. Those are cross references. You'll notice in my Bible, when I get to the full armor of God, there is a letter. Let's see. Oh, sorry. When it says in verse 14, stand firm then with the belt of truth buckled around your waist and the breastplate of righteousness in place. Then they give you notes. Sorry, they give you notes to go to other locations. The first one on the belt of truth is Isaiah 11:5. Here's Isaiah 11:5. Let's actually, sorry, verse 5. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. Now, who is that talking about? Well, the heading for chapter 11 is the branch from Jesse. In verse 1, a shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse, from his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and of understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of the knowledge of and fear of the Lord, and he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt. So this, and faithfulness, the sash around his waist. So the context here is Isaiah is using this idea of armor to describe the Messiah. Okay. Now, if I track down the note on the second part, then we really hone in on the answer to this question. Why is it called the armor of God? In chapter 59, verse 17, it says, he put on righteousness as his breastplate and the helmet of salvation on his head. He put on the garments of vengeance and wrapped himself in zeal as in a cloak. Now, who is that talking about? Well, if you trace this back, chapter 59 of Isaiah is talking about the sin of Israel, how sinful Israel has been. It says in verse 12, for our offenses are many in our sight, and our sins testify against us. Our offenses are ever with us, and we acknowledge our iniquities. Rebellion and treachery against the Lord, turning our backs on our God, inciting revolt and oppression, uttering lies our hearts have conceived. So justice is driven back, and righteousness stands at a distance. Truth has stumbled in the streets, honesty cannot enter. Truth is nowhere to be found, and whoever shuns evil will become prey. The Lord looked and was displeased that there was no justice. He saw that there was no one. He was appalled that there was no one to intervene. So his own arm achieved salvation for him, and his own righteousness sustained him. He put on righteousness as his breastplate, and the helmet of salvation on his head. So when Paul talks about the armor of God, why does he call it the armor of God? Well, because he's drawing from Isaiah, where God himself wears the armor. So when we put on the armor of God, we're not putting on the armor that God, it's not simply the armor that God provides. We are putting on the same armor that God wears. And that's a really important thing to understand as we look at the armor of God. Because if you go back and you look at what's happening in these passages, when the Messiah is wearing this kind of armor and when God is wearing this kind of armor, what kind of problems are they dealing with? They're dealing with problems of social upheaval, social justice. They're dealing with, or I don't want to say social to make you think that this is all about politics or welfare or things like that, but it's corporate sin and corporate problems. It is the problems of groups of people. And so when God puts on his armor, in the context of Isaiah 59, he's coming down to deal with all of the sinfulness in Israel. This is God rolling up his sleeves and punishing his people for all of the injustice that they have done. That's the context here. And so when Paul probably had the Old Testament memorized, he knew the context of these passages. And so when he brings up Isaiah, these passages from Isaiah and the armor of God, he is saying we should deal with with the division and the oppression in the world the same way God does. With one important caveat. You'll notice in Isaiah 59 that part of God's armor is vengeance. And he doesn't tell us to wear that part. In Romans and other places, Paul says, don't seek revenge because vengeance is the Lord's. So revenge is just for God. But he says when we deal with spiritual warfare, which in in Ephesians is these big systemic corporate problems, these structures that oppress people, that dehumanize people, that treat us as less than the image of God. When we confront those, it needs to be with the same tools that God uses, the same weapons that God uses. Because when God confronts evil, he does it in ways that are consistent with his character. He does it with righteousness. He does it with justice. He does it with truth. He does it. And so often we as Christians, we take up God's cause and we do it in ways that are completely against what he stands for and what the kingdom that God is building. The classic, most obvious example is the crusader who is wearing a cross and declaring God is great as he chops somebody's head off, and saying God wills it as he massacres villages. And clearly there is a disconnect between what they're saying and what they're doing. There's a disconnect between their claim or their attempt to represent God and to fight for God and the tactics they're actually using to do it. And so when Paul says put on the armor of God, he's saying put on the armor that God uses when he deals with the forces of darkness and oppression in this world. Behave in the same way he does. And what that looks like, as we talked about in the last two sermons, for Christians, for us that looks like a lot like submission. It looks like creating a society, the church being a society where we are not in competition for power over other people, where we are not trying to dominate others, where success doesn't mean being in control of other people and oppressing other people. We're supposed to build societies where we serve others. And then when we bring people into the church, we can bring them out of that culture of oppression, that culture of dominance, those dark forces, and bring them into a society that reflects God's character. And this is so important to me for the purpose of the church, and something that I haven't really said outright, but is underlying this whole approach to Ephesians. I think it's important for us to recognize that the church is not a pyramid scheme. A pyramid scheme is a business model where you recruit people into your business, you get them to invest in your business, and their first job is to go out and get more people to invest in the business. And then those people go out and get more people to invest. And the only way the business brings in money is by recruiting new investors or new employees that have to pay to be a part of it. But they never actually produce anything. And that's why that's actually a Ponzi scheme. These are illegal. They're fraudulent. And as soon as somebody realizes that nothing's actually being created, then the whole thing falls apart. Well, I think the church is sometimes in danger of being a Ponzi scheme, because we tell people, they come into the church, they become Christians, and then, all right, your goal is simply to go out and make new Christians. And so they go out and make new Christians, and they go out and make new Christians. Meanwhile, the church isn't actually, people aren't actually being changed in the church, or we aren't actually building the church into anything. And the problem, we're not producing anything. And I think that part of what's going on in our culture now, as Christianity is losing ground in some places, is this realization that the church hasn't been producing or those approaches of the gospel have not actually been producing the promises that are made in Scripture. What we need to be doing as the church is we need to actually be creating societies that reflect God's character and God's will for the world. We're not simply a life raft that we get people in and wait for the world to sink. We're supposed to be creating societies where the meek are blessed and the peacemakers are blessed. We're supposed to be creating societies of unity, societies where people are treated fairly and equally, and where we submit to each other. The world likes to use equality as a buzzword, but doesn't actually. But equality, when everybody's on the defensive, it just creates more division. This is what Scripture offers, what the gospel offers, is true open equality where we serve each other and we create a truly unified, a truly reconciled society that is reconciled with each other and with God. We have to, as a church, we have to be producing reconciliation. We have to be producing the fruit of the gospel if we're going to make a difference in the world. That's my 2 cents. All right, thank you for tuning in to Deleted Scenes at this special broadcast time. This, like I said, this Sunday is our centennial, and so I honestly have no idea. I haven't decided yet what we're going to do next Monday for Deleted Scenes. I might take the week off, or I might not, but that'll be posted on the Facebook page in the morning. If you are local, we would love to have you join us for our centennial celebration. Is on Saturday at dinner at 5:30, and the program starts at 7. If you're familiar with Turner Christian Church, if you have a connection, please join us. There's no cover charge and there's no sign-up sheet. So we'd love to have you be there and be a part of the celebration with us. And then we have our centennial service. We're going to have a fellowship time with breakfast foods at 9 in the morning. And then at 10, we will begin our service. That is a special time, 10, not 10:30. So we'd love to have you join us for that if you're local. If you aren't able to make it, both of those events, provided technology cooperates, both of those events will be live broadcast on our YouTube channel. You can find the link to that on turnerchristianchurch.com. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next time on Deleted Scenes.